We're on lesson 3, and Thomas has some extra lessons, and Alan has some extra lessons. So if you do not have a book, raise your hand, and Thomas or Alan will get you a lesson. Now, here's one up here, and Alan, a few over kind of next to the wall. And I'd like we passed out a lot of books, but if you did not get a book, we can make some more up. But I'd like to see, if you did not get a book, would you raise your hand? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, by next Wednesday, maybe we can have a few more books made up and you can have a complete set of the lessons. And of course, we will have a few to pass out, because if you forget your book, well, we still want you to have a lesson. The design of this book, yes, you can, go ahead and look at it and work through it at home, and that's fine. But we're basically working through it, and to a great extent, you can use this as an opportunity to kind of just fill in the blanks as we go along, and that kind of keeps you a little involved with the lesson. And if you write something down, that always helps you to remember things. As I mentioned, this is Now That I'm a Christian at Easter Meadows, and it consists of lessons that if a person had just been baptized, that you would want them to know. But also, if someone were to come to Easter Meadows, kind of some things about Easter Meadows that you would want them to know. It's kind of a combination of those two things. And I realize that most everybody in this class kind of has been a Christian a number of years and probably been at Easter Meadows a number of years. But I think that still it's good to kind of go through it, to see it, to remind ourselves of it. And then, frankly, I would like to then use this in the future, maybe with, occasionally take new members who have been baptized or having come to Easter Meadows, and to have the class for them in a smaller group. The first lesson was from sinner to saints. In other words, kind of how do I become a Christian? The need to, and how do I? The second was from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of God's dear Son. And the idea there is we have been placed in God's church. And we define church having to do with the people of God, God's people. The word assembly, as the word church could be translated, is indicative of a people. In other words, a person becomes a Christian, God places him in His church. He's not a rock. He himself is not the island. It's not, he's unto himself. God made us a part of a people, and it's very obvious that God says we need that people. Now, I know you could find yourself maybe sometime on a Lord's Day, and you're traveling, and maybe you just don't know where the church is. Well, I hope you'll find the Lord's church and assemble with them. Sometimes you cannot. One time we been in our lifetime on 2 cruises. The first one was for our 25th wedding anniversary, and now that's actually ancient history. But on that Sunday, we were going to be in Nassau, Bahamas, and so we put into port, and our goal was to find a church to meet with. And before we had left, I got on the internet and tried to do a search. I couldn't find it, and that's kind of rare because most of the times there's some electronic presence, internet presence and I thought for sure because they're in a place where a lot of visitors come, there would be, but I couldn't find it. So we asked someone in town, where is the Church of Christ? They said, well, I know where that is. It's so-and-so, and they meet so-and-so. Well, then that was a couple of hours later, so we were still in town. So I asked somebody else. They said, no. They have told you about Christ Episcopal Church. I know the Church of Christ that you're asking about because they're on the radio. And in fact, they had the correct information, and we were able to get a taxi and then go worship. But had we not been able to worship, we had actually taken some of the kind of called the portable Lord's Supper, and we were going to worship ourselves. If you find yourself and you cannot assemble with a church, well, you be the assembly. You can't find a church, you be the church. But God put us in the church, a body of people. And so that brings us to this lesson. He's expecting us to assemble with the saints. This is one of those, I've heard sometimes people say, you're preaching to the choir. This is a preaching to the choir lesson. Because see, you're here on Wednesday nights. In other words, I think you're committed to being at the assembly. And let me just say that to you. I appreciate that very, very much. More than I could express. But I think that this is one thing that, once again, somebody that becomes a Christian or comes new to a congregation, they need to realize this is important. And there needs to be a commitment to assemble with the saints. Now, somebody would say, what does the Bible say about it? Well, you have heard, if you've been in the church many years, all those years, Hebrews 10:25. And many of you committed it to memory, probably from the King James Version. That's why I went ahead and just put both the King James and the English Standard. King James, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Now, English Standard is not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. There's a few differences in words. There is no difference in meaning. It's stated in a negative way. That's negative. Forsaking, that's a negative concept. Neglecting, negative concept. If you were to put this in a positive fashion, it would be assemble yourselves together. Mark? I read something about this several weeks ago that, like you would say, an increased oppression. China is not a free society. They become more open economically, but religiously, no. Most churches would still have been, I use the term underground, somewhat secret. And depending on the nation, the society, through history, at times the church has existed that way. Kind of similarly, and I say similarly, not to that extent by any means, but when in Ukraine several years ago, when the Ukrainian rebels, the pro-Russian element, took over one of the church's buildings in Gorlovka, and very much so was taking over and did take over the Donetsk region, much of it. They were saying the only church, in fact that's what they said in that assembly, the only church in Donetsk should be the Russian Orthodox Church. So everything else kind of was cracked down on. And then shortly after that, there was a lot of fighting in Slavyansk, a significant amount of fighting in Slavyansk. Slavyansk was only like maybe 20 to 30 minutes from Kramatorsk. I mean, it'd be like Montgomery to Prattville, kind of the difference. And then, of course, some of it came into Kramatorsk itself. And there was even, there was shelling. There was also, you might say, the troops. And I got on the phone and I called Vlad and I said, Vlad, I said, given what happened in Gorlovka, it may be advisable to take down the church sign. In other words, no, you still meet. You still be Christians. But you don't have to be a target for those rebel soldiers. And they took over the church in Gorlovka, and they still have it as far as I know. They use that building. And they could have done the same thing there. Now, fortunately, the rebels ran out. Ukraine took even back Slavyansk, but then they kind of drew lines and then just fussed over those lines, and that's how it's kind of been mostly since. But sometimes it could be difficult to assemble. Sometimes church may even be, we use the term underground, but here, not forsaking assembling of ourselves together. By the way, if you were to talk about the Lord's church and biblical times, was there persecution then? Was it always easy then? That's absolutely not. And to the Hebrew Christians, they had suffered, in the King James Version, I think it's chapter 10 maybe, spoiling of your goods. But then also says they've not yet resisted unto blood. So it sounds like they'd had even things of their own confiscated, but they hadn't yet lost their lives. So they were under persecution, yet still, he says, forsaking not the assembly. Real quickly. Number one, the Old Testament and the Sabbath. What day was the Sabbath? Seventh day, go back to Exodus 28 through 11. He's very clear. The seventh day is the Sabbath. Were they given specific instructions about how to keep the Sabbath? We'll go yes. And then how often were the Jews to keep the Sabbath? How often? Every Sabbath day. And in Exodus 20 verse 8, where he says, honor the Sabbath day and to keep it holy, he doesn't have the word every there. But if it was implied and they understood it. In fact, when you get over to Numbers 15, 32 to 36, you find that there was a man who was found picking up sticks on the Sabbath, which violated the Sabbath law, and he was to be stoned. Now, if I had been him, I'd say, I want the best lawyer there is. And here's my case. Here's my case. You didn't say every Sabbath. You said honor the Sabbath day. And last Sabbath, I honored it. You let me live. I'll honor him from here on out. I just missed the one. I just violated that one Sabbath day. And you didn't say every. Obviously, every was implied. So, how do you come to that conclusion? Well, I just kind of explained that. Number two, the New Testament and the first day of the week. This was the day Jesus was what? Resurrected. This was the day the apostles were filled with the what? Holy Spirit. This was the day when the gospel of Jesus Christ was first preached in its completeness. This was the day when the church was established. This was the day the disciples came together in Acts 20 verse 7 to what? Break bread, and which is the Lord's Supper. This was the day the disciples came together to, in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, what? To give. And so you put all this together and you see a definite pattern and significance of the first day of the week. And this was the day when John was in the Spirit and wrote a book when he received, which was the book of Revelation. And he describes that as the Lord's Day. Now there is some dispute, some discussion. Is it necessarily to be implied the first day of the week by the term Lord's Day? And I recognize there can be a discussion and there can be reasons for both. I think probably yes, he's talking about here the first day of the week, the Lord's Day. Now an interesting thing is, okay, here's the Bible. when you take a step outside of the Bible, you understand this. You're not in the Bible, it's not authoritative. If it's in the Bible, it's authoritative. You're out of the Bible, it's not authoritative. However, it is interesting to see, and I think faith building to see what happens sometimes in those early centuries after the church was established. And here I've got 3 quotes. One from the letter of Pliny the Younger to Emperor Trajan. Kind of read that quickly, and I hope you just look at it, read along with me. However, they assured me that the main of their fault or of their mistake was this. And mind you, this is being written by people who are not Christians, about Christians in this instance. That they were wont on a stated day to meet together before it was light, to sing a hymn to Christ as to a God alternately, and to oblige themselves by a sacrament or oath not to do anything that was ill, but that they would commit no theft or pilfering or adultery, that they would not break their promises or deny what was deposited with them when it was required back again. After which it was their custom to depart, to meet again at a common but innocent meal, which they had left off upon that edict which I published at your command, and wherein I had forbidden such conventicles. So here you can see, in the midst of a difficult time, persecution, they were meeting. Epistle of Barnabas, about 100 AD, and at this point, we're talking about written from a Christian perspective. Moreover, God says to the Jews, your new moons and Sabbaths I cannot endure. You see how he says, the present Sabbaths are not acceptable to me, but the Sabbath which I have made, in which I have rested from all things, I will make the beginning of the 8th day, which is the beginning of another world. Wherefore we Christians keep the 8th day for joy, on which Jesus arose from the dead, and when he appeared, ascended into heaven. Now I know we kind of could, 8th day, and kind of scratch our heads. Well, you look at a calendar, you start on the first day. When you get to the 8th day, guess where you're back around to? The first day. So here he is establishing they met and they worshipped on the first day. Now, first apology of Justin, and once again we'd be talking about from a Christian perspective. And on the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Then when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray. And as before said, when our prayer is ended, bread and wine and water are brought, and the president in like manner offers prayers and thanksgivings according to his ability, and the people assent, saying amen. And there's distribution to each and a participation of that over which thanks have been given. And to those who are absent, a portion is sent by the deacons. And they who are well-to-do and willing give what each thinks fit, and what is collected is deposited with the president, who succors or helps the orphans and widows, and those who, and we're going to say, and etc. We don't have time to read everything. You got it. But here you find Sunday, and you find what they were doing and how similar that is certainly to what you find in the New Testament. But as I said, these things we've just read, they're outside the Bible. They're not authoritative. They can be faith-strengthening, though, to see that Christians were doing what we read of there in the Bible. Well, number four. What are some other reasons? Okay, the Bible says attend. But what are some of the other reasons to worship on the Lord's Day other than the command, Hebrews 10:25, and the example that we had of those Christians in Acts 20 verse 7? What are some other reasons? Encouragement. Very good. That old story about the fellow who just never would assemble, and the preacher goes to see him, and he's got a big fire in his fireplace, and He rakes aside one of the coals. He stays there long enough, and that fire is still burning bright. That coal that he pulled away from the fire, it's getting cold now. We need the encouragement. We don't assemble, we get cold.
Really good reason is if you take the Sabbath, that's the end of the week after you went the whole week and you're 4 hours. Here you start out a spiritual week on a high note at the very beginning of the beginning.
Okay. Spiritual high note come Sunday. What else? What? Learning. The Bible class worship, part of that worship assembly is teaching, preaching. What else might you have to say? I hope y'all heard what Charlie said. I knew a man that was deaf in Mississippi when we were worshiping and preaching. He was not at Rocky Creek. He was at Loosedale Church. He was deaf. There was no interpreter. He just sat through it. He couldn't hear a thing, but he was there every Lord's Day. Oh boy. And he never heard a bad sermon, Alan said. Yep. Somebody else started to say something over this way. Showing unity. Okay. And one of the things I put down, which I think that you've kind of said as well, I just put down the word worship. That's important. And there's, for a Christian who believes what he needs to believe, there is the innate need for that. Number 5, what are reasons to attend Bible classes, a second assembly on the Lord's Day, or a midweek class? What would be some reasons to attend that? Like you're here tonight. All the things we just said. Okay.
Add to it, we love the Lord. Because we love Him, we want to worship and study His Word.
You know, okay, take the word love with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, or go like to Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. It's kind of like then at that juncture, if I'm really achieving that, if I'm really doing that, how do I say no to the assembly and the assemblies other than just the Sunday morning assembly? Anybody else? To study deeper. Very much so. Very much so. Reminded of what we already know. You know, I have an idea that there's not a book of the Bible you haven't read through, studied through, and been in a class on. And so probably every class you're in, it's almost like, well, this is a repeat. But guess what? We need to be reminded. We will forget if we're not reminded. Anybody else? Support each other. The result will be strengthening our faith. There's an article here, and I found it very interesting. And consider the following article, and then I've got here, not by a member of the Church of Christ. So I got a little disclaimer there. But he makes some observations. And I think it's kind of interesting that, okay, this isn't a guy that's in the church with an axe to grind. This is somebody that's outside the church. But he makes some, I think, Wise observations. 10 reasons why committed Christians attend church less. Now somebody might argue, well, is it really committed if you're attending church less? Well, we're not going to fuss about that. I just think, look at the reasons. One, he says greater affluence. Greater affluence. And frankly, yes, there is greater affluence. Because when I was a kiddo, the average size house as compared to now the average size house that's built is considerably larger, probably even nearly double. When I was a kiddo, I remember, many families would have had one automobile. Now it's kind of like there's an automobile for everybody in the family. If we went back a previous generation, my mother was raised with 3 rooms and a bath. Y'all know what that is, don't you? Well, so yes, there's greater affluence. Well, with more affluence, guess what? There's more possibilities. I'm not stuck at home on the weekend. I could actually go somewhere. I've got the money to do it. Well, I am stuck. I got to be here. No. You understand what I'm saying? And the ways that men can, with their money now, entertain themselves. Greater affluence. And he discusses that. Number 2. Higher focus on kids' activities. He says a growing number of kids are playing sports. I believe this compared to, once again, if you went back a generation or two. Brooks and both my kids played the sports. Beth just a couple of years, Brooks a lot of years. And one year at East Montgomery, mind you, that's just one place that Little League ball was going on in Montgomery. One place. It was behind Goodwin. And I just say this, you drive down Perry Hill Road, you don't have any idea what all is going on back there and how many fields are back there. One year, there were 100 teams playing on those fields, 1,300 kids. And that was just one place where there was Little League baseball in Montgomery. And there were probably nearly half a dozen places. Now, I don't know how well East Montgomery ball is doing now, but that was a lot of people. Well, I want to tell you something. It keeps you busy. It keeps you busy. Before the season started, there were usually 3 practices a week. When the season started, there were probably 2 practices and 2 games. And then, we were lucky to be at East Montgomery because they didn't have Wednesday games and they didn't have Sunday games. Now the exceptions. If there were rainouts, they might have one Sunday afternoon. And then it got to be so many kids playing and so many teams, they really couldn't work all the games in, so they started having some Wednesday games. There were like maybe 2. And Brooks played on Wednesday, and it got time for him to be in Bible class, and we pulled him off the mound and said, "Bye, Coach." And he knew we were leaving. On the other hand, the Chisholm ball field, they did completely different. It was beside our old building. They had Wednesday games every week, and they didn't have Saturday games. I thought, wow, how do you not have Saturday games in Little League? But that's the way they did it. Well, now there's even travel ball, which travel ball is all together weekend. And a lot of kids do it. You just read through and what he says, and it's sort of this can be a hindrance. If you let it, I'm not saying playing ball is wrong. No. But affluence, that's not wrong. But he's right that some of these things have become a hindrance to some folks. 3, more travel. That kind of goes along with the more affluence. I related this to you a few weeks ago. It's a number of years ago when probably travel trailers and the weekend camping was more common. There was a church outside of Mobile, probably a church of about 150. And the preacher there, good man, good preacher, and he was just kind of frustrated. He said, we're having a hard time. He says, we've got about any Sunday, there's about 10 families or more that are off camping. And he said, they're good families and otherwise they're faithful families. But he says, it's hard for us to do the work of the church with so many of our folks gone. And but more travel. 4, blended and single-parent families. Well, it talks here about, the difficulty of a single-parent family. Oftentimes they're working to make ends meet because there's only one income. And so then that work interferes. Or maybe if there is, say, a divorce and custodial, non-custodial parent are shared, well, guess what? That kid may be in church every Sunday, but it's 2 different churches, likely. And so perfect attendance for him is missing half the Sundays. That's just a reality, and that's one of the reasons for less church attendance. Number 5, online options. Somebody deciding to watch church on TV. 6, the cultural disappearance of guilt. I don't feel guilty if I don't go. There's a lot of people that are here because they would feel guilty if they didn't go. You know what? There is a proper place for guilt. And if I don't worship my Lord on the Lord's Day, I ought to feel guilty because I've done wrong. But there is truly a cultural disappearance of guilt. 7, self-directed spirituality. I do it my way. 8, failure to see a direct benefit. I only do what I see benefits me. I don't see that this particular... I don't know if I'll get a lot out of it, so I ain't going to worry about being there. And number 9, valuing attendance over engagement. While someone merely attends church, the likelihood of showing up regularly or even engaging their faith decreases over time, attending a massive culture shift. I really think the guy hit the nail on the head a lot of times in this article. So he's not in the church, but I get bulletins from a few congregations, talk with people in various places, and there's almost no congregation that has a similar attendance on Sunday night and Wednesday night to the Sunday morning assembly. There are a few, they're few and far between. In fact, most cases it probably drops at the best to 60% being back. And in some cases it drops to only 30% being back. And in some cases, some congregations have they've given up and they've quit trying on Sunday nights or maybe on Wednesday nights. And even if it gets tougher, gets harder, do we give up? Do we quit? Do we say, well, folks aren't coming, so we're not going to do? Well, all the benefits that come from the assemblies and what we do here, then we lose it completely for everybody if we give up on it. Okay, I've got one last question here. What are some other reasons? I think he's pretty good at the 10. But what are some other reasons people do not attend regularly? And you know what? That just not the most important thing. In fact, we were talking about reasons to attend, and Charlie said love of God. It's kind of like that is a bottom line. If it was the most important thing, none of these 10 things he listed they wouldn't even be on the page. What else? Anybody else? Any other reasons people don't?
Steve, I might add that some people think that Sunday night and Wednesday night services are just not required because they weren't instituted in the church until probably World War II. I've actually heard people make that argument. So, we didn't have Sunday night and Wednesday night services until after World War II. So they use that as justification for not doing it. Strange.
Health issues, let me just say this. There are legitimate reasons people cannot come. And health issues certainly is that. Taking care of someone who has health issues, certainly one of those reasons. Or a person getting to the point that they are frail. It's not they're immediately sick, but they're frail. And they don't have strength and energy that they formerly did. There are legitimate reasons people cannot be in the assembly.
A general feeling of not being accepted or inadvertently excluded.
Okay. That's very good. You don't want me here anyway, do you? You know, if somebody feels that way, probably not going to come back. Might not be back.
It's all about actually another congregation in town because we were there for 2 years, and even while wearing a badge that said member with our name on it, people would still come up to us and ask, "Are y'all visiting? Never seen you here before."
Maybe they got bad memories like I do. Work. And let's recognize sometimes that is necessary and legitimate. My dad, he called it tour work. Every week he changed shifts. I don't know how he survived it because, you know, every week your sleep pattern changes. And he only had 6 Sundays a year that were actually off Sundays. So some Sundays he was working either morning or afternoon, and if he was off both, it meant he had worked the whole night before. And so, work issues. Interestingly, though, when he was retired, and it's time to quit. Guys, anybody come in? When Dad retired, he was offered a job at a funeral home in Tuscaloosa. But it was unique how they did things. They said, when you're on 24 hours and you cannot leave. We've got a little apartment here with a bed and a little kitchen. Well, can I go, can I take an hour to go to church on Sundays? No. When you're on 24, you're well, Dad was retired. Dad was not rich, but he was living without that income. And he just said, I don't have to have this job. If it's going to keep me from being at this assembly, I'm not going to go. Now, when he was raising us, had to have the job. And that prevented him being their son. Anybody else?
After what he said, I thought, one day somebody asked me if I was visiting here. I said, no. He said, well, I am.
I thought maybe it's kind of, no, I just grew the beard last week. Anybody else? Well, hopefully, okay.
One last one, sir, to Paul Tracy of previous point, low income, when people are getting so low, they tend to use that reason as a yardstick not to come to the gathering such as this one. It's not deliberate, but because they get so beat up on their bills.
When you say low income too, that can affect your ability for transportation. You don't have a car in Montgomery, in the United States, it's hard to get around. And at night, and odd times, buses are not as convenient. Now, some European cities where everybody depends on public transportation is kind of a little different. But I mentioned this too. This is many years ago. Guys, come on in. We were. Well, we start our devotional in 2 minutes. But years ago, we were on vacation. We were in New York City, and we went to a congregation there. And it was kind of interesting. People came, walked. There was one person that came on rollerblades, but we had to come on the subway. It took 2 subways, and the subway was like sardines because of the time of day it was. Well, I think on Sundays they had 200 or 300 people. That evening was like 30 or 40, and I think it wasn't just I don't care to come. It was literally physically impossible for a lot of those people to leave their jobs and somehow deal with their family, and they couldn't maybe go home, which was in maybe another borough and maybe in New Jersey, and then get back. It was just logistically impossible to do. But the low income, which he mentions that kind of on the idea of the single parent. Let me mention one other thing about the low income part. If a congregation, he also mentions the very first one was greater affluence. So then there can be a disparity, greater affluence, lower income. Let us work to be sure that whether it's someone greater affluence or lower income, that they feel just as welcome, needed, accepted, wanted, a part of things, important. We better quit or they might not come.